We will get started in just a moment. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our final Food for Thought speaker series of the year. We will be going out with a bang. This year, we have hijacked our Food for Thought series for a book launch for a recently released book that the ISSP spearheaded. It's the fruits of a multi-year research project. L'événement aura lieu en anglais, mais si jamais vous avez des questions, soyez-vous bien à l'aise de les poser en français lorsque nous arrivons à la période de questions de l'événement. We'll begin with the Indigenous affirmation of the University of Ottawa. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I would encourage everybody to acknowledge the land from which they are joining us today. So before getting into the event for today, I'd like to introduce you to the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. If you're not familiar with us, we are a cross-faculty research institute at the University of Ottawa, exploring the links among science, society, and policy. Our 5-year strategic vision is to help Canada transform decision-making to meet the grand challenges of our time. At the Institute, we pursue this strategic vision by strengthening relationships among academia, business, government, Indigenous organizations, and civil society. The book we'll be discussing today is a nice illustration of that in action. We have 3 key focus areas in our strategic plan at the Institute: fostering public trust in expertise and expert-based decision-making, supporting co-production of government policies by government, business, Indigenous, academic, and civil society leaders, and weaving together technological and social innovation. Again, you will see those focus areas shine through in our session today. So this event is the first in a series of book promotion activities that will take place over the course of the next year for our very recently, hot off the presses, recently published book, Democratizing Risk Governance, Bridging Science, Expertise, Deliberation and Public Values. A book that we were so pleased and are so pleased to have published in open access. So we will be sharing with you a link to the open access version of the book. Feel free to purchase a hard copy if you like, but no need if you'd like to access it in open access. That is what that's there for. So the book is the fruit of a multi-year research study. I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing that study, and then we're going to hear from a number of our research team members. We're delighted to have with us today 2 of our chapter authors and 1 of our senior risk practitioners who participated throughout the study. First, Dr. Laura Nurala, Senior Policy Analyst at the Strategic Policy Branch at Health Canada. Prior to this, Laura spent close to 7 years in increasingly senior policy positions at Natural Resources Canada. Laura has considerable expertise in the energy sector, notably on questions of public confidence in policy and risk decision-making. Laura was one of a number of students who completed their PhD during the at-risk project. Congratulations, Laura. Our second speaker will be Dr. Kieran O'Doherty, who is a faculty member in the Department of Psychology at the University of Guelph. As a researcher focused on the social and ethical aspects of science and technology, Kieran has expertise in health, in public deliberation, in bioethics, in qualitative methods, the human microbiome, the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomics, and theoretical psychology. Basically, Kieran is a super interesting guy. He has helped develop methods for public deliberation that allow community members to provide input on policy decisions for complex, controversial topics, such as childhood vaccination. That's what he's going to be speaking with us about today. And he's also used these processes for areas like the use of personal data for research. Kieran's community-engaged work in this area is motivated by the belief that policy decisions that affect large numbers of people should be informed not only by experts, but also by the people that they will affect. So one of the primary reasons we were just so delighted to have Kieran on the research team for this project. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Frank Welsh, who recently retired from his post as the Director of Policy for the Canadian Public Health Association, where he was responsible for developing policy alternatives and supporting advocacy on public health issues. Prior to joining CPHA, Frank held managerial and director level positions with the federal government and worked in science-based regulatory and policy development, business, and strategic planning. Among his current activities, he is a board member of Outdoor Play Canada, a very fascinating engagement that he shared with us over the course of the project. So delighted to have you with us today, Frank. So I'm going to begin with a brief presentation just to give you folks who are attending a bit of an overview of this project that led to the book. I'll just share my screen here. And then we'll get into the presentations from each of our speakers. So this book is the fruit of a multi-year research project called At Risk. And the genesis of At Risk is really about, how can we help to strengthen Canada's ability to manage risk? When I was first appointed director of the ISSP, one of the things that I noticed in my conversations with folks across the Institute is that across a variety of different policy sectors, the whole question of how do we democratize risk governance? How do we navigate situations where expert perceptions of risk differ from public perceptions of risk? How do we do a better job of risk communication? How do we involve people in risk decision making? All of these questions were just so common across a whole host of different policy sectors. And so, we decided at the Institute to spearhead a project to do some comparative work, looking across a variety of different policy fields with the aim of helping Canada to strengthen its capacity to undertake risk decision making. We used case studies in 3 different policy fields: public health, energy, and genomics. So you're going to hear about public health and energy today. Subsequent sessions will expand that out to also look at genomics. And we also used, in keeping with our approach at the Institute, a co-production approach where we involved risk practitioners and partner organizations throughout the study. And Frank's participation here today is an illustration of that. So the team. For those who are having a look at the open access book right now, you'll see that we have many, many researchers who participated in this research. At the inception of the work, 24 established and emerging scholars from 11 universities in Canada and the United States. Over time, that number expanded to over 30 as students were engaged and other collaborators began participating. So just a great process that expanded over time. And we had 5 risk practitioners from a number of partner organizations participate in the team over the course of the research. Our partner organizations are listed here. We included partner organizations from public health, from energy, and from genomics. That was a very explicit choice. And we were very fortunate in terms of funding to have received a partnership development grant that was co-funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and Genome Canada. And we also received additional funding from our partner organizations and from the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Social Sciences. So what are the cases? So in energy, we had 3 cases, one looking at nuclear waste management, so the site selection process for the long-term storage of high-level nuclear waste in Canada. And you'll see in the brackets here, each of the author teams. A case on hydraulic fracturing, you're going to hear from Laura today on that case. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And by a postdoctoral researcher at the time with us here at the Institute, Patricia Larkin. In genomics, we had 2 cases, one on genetically engineered salmon. The lead author there, Jennifer Kuzma, was a Fulbright research scholar with us from North Carolina State University, so we were delighted to continue the collaboration with Jennifer. We have a case on newborn blood spot screening that was led by Stuart Nichols from the Ottawa Health Research Institute and collaborators. In public health, we had quite a few cases in public health, cancer screening, childhood vaccination. You're going to hear about that from Kieran today, water fluoridation at the municipal level. And, this was a multi-year project that also took place during, yes, a global public health pandemic. So, of course, we added chapters on COVID-19 and specifically on COVID-19 vaccine decision-making. One, looking at culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and the second, looking at the creation of vaccine priority groups here in Canada. The book also includes 3 cross-cutting chapters on the concept of motivated reasoning, which we're going to have a whole panel on motivated reasoning coming up in the fall, another cross-cutting chapter on science and values, and then a third cross-cutting chapter looking at science, technology, and society education. And the latter 2 chapters were authored by senior fellows at the Institute, Heather Douglas and Gregor Wolbring. The lead author on our motivated reasoning chapter is our former research director, Dr. Marissa Beck. So I'm going to bring this to a close really quickly because we want to get into our chapters. But what I wanted to just share with you is that over the course of the research, and this is laid out in the introduction of the book, a number of dilemmas of risk governance and democratization emerged. And so, the first relates to public trust in risk governance. We know how important it is that people trust in risk decisions. And I think there was quite a bit of debate, not only within the team, but also beyond in broader society. How far do we go in terms of securing public trust? Yes, it is the holy grail for risk governance, but if we go, too far in terms of trying to secure public trust, could this potentially compromise the risk and evidence-based decisions of when it comes to risk governance? Risk perception and motivated reasoning. So the concept of motivated reasoning, which we're going to, as I mentioned, get into in a broader panel in the fall, is really about, the way in which all of us perceive risks through the lens of our values, our worldviews, our identities, our experiences. And this is not only for the general public, but for scientists themselves. And this opens up, a whole series of questions around how do we do a better job of valuing values in risk decision making, but how do we do so also in a way that ensures that we are retaining the evidence-based decision making that underpins much of risk governance. The third area is around public participation in risk decision making. Does public participation, involving the public in decisions that affect them when it comes to risk, does that lead to stronger decisions, or does it potentially lead to weaker decisions? And again, these are areas where there was a lot of debate, I think, amongst members of the team. We didn't necessarily come to agreement on this, but what we were trying to do with this book in terms of, looking forward, our book is not the last word on these dilemmas. It's very much an opportunity and an invitation to find insight within them. We certainly did that as a team. And the book and the cases really shine light on that pivotal role of trust in risk decision making, on the complex factors that shape risk perception and the importance of better understanding what shapes risk perception, and the importance of developing thoughtful approaches to public participation. So making sure that we are utilizing, mechanisms that are seeking public input on the right things at the right time, using the right approaches. So with that, we're going to turn to our speakers for today. It gives me great pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Laura Narala. So pleased, and again, congratulations, Laura, on your doctoral dissertation, successful defense, and delighted to have you with us here today. So Laura, floor is yours.
Monica, I couldn't have done it without you, so I really appreciate it. I'm just going to take a second here to share my screen. I do have a presentation, so bear with me. And if you could let me know if you can see it, that would be great. Great, thank you. So as Monica mentioned, I just recently completed my PhD research, and some of the work that I did with ISSP was directly related to that, and I'm here to sort of present that research to you today. So just giving here a brief overview, I'll go through the context of my case study. I'm looking at hydraulic fracturing in New Brunswick. So I'll provide some of the context there, highlight some of the key factors for risk and trust, get into some of the research objectives, the theoretical approach, the way that I designed the study, and then key findings. So in terms of the context, first of all, shale development in New Brunswick emerged in sort of 2011, but the technology itself in 2007 was emerging and unconventional. It was little understood and targeted towards the extraction of an unconventional form of oil and gas. And in its early days, there was unknown impacts on the environment and human health. So this sort of characterized the early days of that technology. And as I mentioned, shale gas potential in New Brunswick really picked up around 2009, where there was commercial interest in exploring it in New Brunswick. And it was identified that there might be a large mass of provincial land that was anticipated to hold significant resource potential. Important to this context here is that not only was it early days of hydraulic fracturing, but it was also early days of exploring in New Brunswick. So there wasn't a clear sense in the beginning if the actual shale deposits, the geological resource existed in New Brunswick. It was just projected to. And so that's one big thing here. Another thing to note is with shale potential came a large economic opportunity. So the government in New Brunswick had projected, a large amount of royalty fees to be gained. And New Brunswick is a province with debt and limited economic growth at the time. And this was really seen as an opportunity in New Brunswick. So in anticipation of this opportunity, the government launched a series of 10 public engagement mechanisms. And I look at this over the course of 10 years between 2007 and 2017. So it's particularly interesting in the case of New Brunswick is you have this impetus for this major development that could have significant economic potential. You have the government launching a lot of different engagement mechanisms to sort of figure out how to get the public involved in making this decision happen and to have shale proceed. But in the end, in 2014, there was a significant, decisive sort of policy change that characterized the landscape for shale development, and a new government was elected, the Liberal government that established a moratorium on the practice in 2014. So this effectively banned fracking in New Brunswick. So by banning fracking, they had banned shale development. And once the Liberals did this, they also put in place a commission. And this was sort of the last public engagement mechanism that was launched to sort of look into whether fracking could proceed if 5 conditions could be fulfilled. One of those main conditions was whether they could garner social acceptance. And ultimately, it was deemed that the 5 conditions could not be met, and the moratorium on fracking was extended indefinitely. So that's just a little bit for the context. So in terms of the research objectives, I was interested in exploring the implications of risk for decision-making in the process of engaging the public, really focusing here on the role of trust and lay knowledge and their impact of learning among policy actors. So I do come from a public administration background, so bear with me. There's some public admin type implications here for the research, but what that means really is that there's a lot of literature that sort of reinforces that trust can be built by engaging the public, and that by reinforcing that engagement and that learning amongst actors, that it could potentially lead to better policy outcomes and outcomes that people would accept more easily. And so I was interested in looking at that here. And specifically, there's a theoretical framework. It's called the Advocacy Coalition Framework. It's used a lot in public administration research, but particularly in the subfields of sort of energy and in the environment. And so I was interested in using this widely used framework and test an alternative hypothesis to advance the theory a little bit. So the approach was to build on the Advocacy Coalition framework. So very simply, the Advocacy Coalition framework looks at how interests influence the policy process. So in this vein, it's interested in policy change. And as I noted, in New Brunswick, there was a major policy change with the ban of fracking. And then one major path to policy change that it posits is through this learning. And so engagement really is important here. So the way that the framework positions it is sort of technocratic in nature, and like a lot of the literature, it really focuses on experts and expert knowledge in decision making. So their core hypothesis is focused on educated debate and engagement amongst experts that can lead to learning, but it doesn't account for public engagement. And that was something that, in a context of risk like hydraulic fracturing, I was really interested in sort of understanding. Especially in a case where there was so much public engagement, as I mentioned. So the research proposed moving beyond expert knowledge to incorporate lay knowledge. And so I was able to do this by focusing on the role of beliefs in learning. And here, according to the ACF, I focused on the role of normative beliefs that's more associated with social experiences versus cognitive beliefs that's associated a bit more with the scientific research. Ultimately, the research incorporated an understanding, was trying to incorporate an understanding of how people learn in their environment, how they perceive the risk in context of uncertainty, and how that sort of advocates or shapes how they advocate for what are the outcomes that they want to see in their day-to-day life. So a little bit on the study itself. I focused on a single case study in depth for policy change in New Brunswick. The case study is looking at sort of the real world context there. So to do that, I did a lot of primary and secondary documentary analysis. I did thematic media analysis of the anti and pro shale positions. So relying on provincial news articles from the media. And then I did a thematic analysis of key informant interviews, of which I had about 30. So recall, I set out to sort of explore the role of trust and lay knowledge and their impact on learning. So over the course of the 10-year period under study from 2007 to 2017, I did find that aligned with sort of the ACF premise that two coalitions emerged around hydraulic fracturing in the province. One coalition was a coalition of actors that sort of coordinated their actions for promoting shale development in the province, and one coalition of actors sort of advocated against shale development. And throughout the 10-year period, it became pretty clear that the pro-shale coalition argued strongly that shale development could proceed safely and effectively with regulation. So they sort of hinged their argument on this deferral to expert authority that fracking could proceed and it could proceed in a safe manner. And in line with this, one of the main engagement exercises that they took on the government of New Brunswick was to develop some of the strictest and most stringent rules for industry. And they set out to consult on these. So they had about 116 changes in regulation that would make their oil and gas framework more stringent. And they had they hired a doctor from the University of Moncton to engage across the province. And his mandate was to solicit feedback from citizens and ultimately provide a report that summarized the issues. That process itself was mired in a lot of controversy, and it turned out that the report was sort of proposing a path forward on shale development when people had been pretty vocal in saying no, or felt that they had been pretty vocal in saying no. And it sort of impacted trust, but as this was happening, it also turned out that the doctor had falsified his credentials. He was an academic, and this served to sort of further mistrust in a process that was already being undermined. Part of this was in terms of the arguments that were made from the pro-shale coalition. They sort of made strong claims over and over again that there was not enough information to decide. So they were able to call into question the pro-coalition's core argument and deferral to expert authority by questioning if there was enough information to actually make decisions. And over time, the issue of shale development became one of social acceptance, rather than whether or not the hydraulic fracturing practice was safe. But it became a bit more about, do we accept to have this in our province and it impact our people and our livelihood? So one key thing here is that it's really important to understand that people were able to point to their lived experiences in the past where they had come across sort of issues of regulation, and particularly issues in enforcement in New Brunswick, where they didn't trust that even if regulation did exist, that it would be even enforced. So you have this context of risk that we're saying we can manage, but people didn't even trust that it could be managed, let alone enforced. And they pointed to sort of past experiences with this, especially in the case where a community had lost their water and had to live without water for quite some time, and there were no appropriate mechanisms for remediation. So in this case, as I said, it's really important to sort of understand that public engagement and trust when it came to the context of risk. Public engagement particularly meant that a broad network of actors were engaged into decision-making. And as I mentioned, in some cases, it led to further mistrust. And the public sort of were able to show that, the calculations, these technically defined calculations of risk, didn't sort of apply to them. It's not what they understood for their world and what it would mean for their livelihoods in the province. So that was sort of a quick overview of the chapter itself. I think the implications are beyond just energy. I think that lay knowledge sort of factors into a lot of decision-making processes, and I'm obviously interested to sort of explore that a little bit more amongst the panel and for the rest of this discussion. But that was just a quick preview of what I found in the context of fracturing.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciate the overview and recognizing it's tough to dive into all of the details in such a short period of time. You did just a great job. So looking forward to diving into that more when we get to the discussion session. For now, Kieran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'll be talking a little bit about the chapter I wrote together with my colleagues, and I just want to highlight them as well. That's Kim Chong, Amanda Rotella, and Elizabeth Cooper. And we wrote about childhood vaccination. And many of the key themes are actually very similar to what Laura emphasized, and that is, the importance of public engagement, public trust, and so on. The context, of course, is different, and I think maybe that's worth digging into a little bit. So childhood vaccination is widely regarded as one of the most successful and effective public health interventions. And it's widely regarded and portrayed as both effective and safe. However, especially with, even before, but especially during COVID, there were a lot of there was a lot of controversy around vaccination, not necessarily specifically childhood vaccination. And I want to emphasize that our chapter is about childhood vaccination. So COVID is a somewhat different case. And at the end of the chapter, we added an appendix where we explain some of the differences and commonalities to the COVID case. But we don't do this in the chapter, but I think maybe this is important for me to do now a little bit, to kind of portray how I think vaccine controversies are typically looked at. And so one kind of one kind of observation that many scholars have made in the field is that when you look at public engagement around vaccination or public acceptance of vaccination, these kind of studies, there's a lot of expert discourse around people just don't understand. If they don't agree with vaccination, that they just don't understand. And a number of scholars have kind of debunked that approach. I think most notable is probably Maya Goldenberg, who said really it's not about information, it's really about trust. So on the whole, then the new argument goes that if people aren't vaccinating, or if they're vaccine hesitant, it has to do with trust more so than vaccination. So that's kind of one thing. The other thing, and this is, I think, has been written about less, is that when people do acknowledge that there's controversy around vaccination, the field is really quite polarized, and it's often framed as being pro-science or anti-science. So if you're for vaccination, you clearly are pro-science, and if you're against vaccination, well, clearly you must be anti-science. And I think that's a very problematic framing, because it stops us from moving forward constructively in this space. And in our chapter is an example of how we can think about the vaccination space outside of that science, anti-science framing, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So when we think about vaccination as an effective public health intervention, the immediate response is to say, well, it's effective, we should do it, right? But what we find when we study people's responses to vaccination, that there are not just concerns about safety and efficacy, there are other issues that come up. Most importantly, and this is what our chapter really focuses on, is that there are certain policy level decisions that are really quite independent of the science. And I'll give an example. And that is, should vaccination be mandatory or compulsory, or should it be voluntary? That's really a question that is quite independent of the science of the effectiveness of vaccination. So we might all say, many of us might agree. So I might say, for example, I'm very much pro-vaccination because I'm convinced by the science. I think it's a good idea. However, I know that there are some people who are not convinced. And because we live in a democratic society, I don't think they should be forced to vaccinate. Now, somebody else might disagree with me and say, well, actually, they should be forced to vaccinate. But here now we have a very interesting debate that is independent of the science, because we might both agree that the science is clear that vaccination is a great thing, but we disagree about this question of mandatoriness. And so we argue in our chapter that even if you accept the safety and efficacy of vaccination, there remain value-based questions that are unanswered by the science, and that really you need democratic input to have before making policy decisions that are binding to a population. And we observe, number one, we observe that there's very little in the way of such mechanisms for public input and public deliberation in Canada and also in many other countries. And we also observe that this is troubling for a number of reasons. One, from a kind of a democratic perspective, but also from a public trust perspective, as we've talked about. And so in the chapter, we discuss a case study of one deliberative process that was conducted by my research group a number of years ago on childhood vaccination, and we don't go through the entire process that's published elsewhere, but we discuss in detail the implications of such a process for policy, and we also discuss some of the findings and the implications for policy there. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kieran. And it makes me think back, what a great presentation. It makes me think back to a very early exchange that we had, you and I think around, sort of around the table with the research team, as, are some of the debates that we have around risk really values discussions kind of wrapped up in the language of risk. Excellent insights. And every time I hear you speak, Karen, I'm learning something new. So looking forward to diving into a discussion on that. So now we turn things to Frank, and really looking forward to, and certainly in the context of the project, having practitioners on the research team who could comment on what they were hearing, what they were learning, bring their experiences as practitioners to the table. Really looking forward to your comments, Frank, and we will, just for those who are in attendance, we will have an opportunity for Q&A after this, so please start thinking of your questions. Frank, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I'd like to thank both Karen and Laura for their presentations, because without the work they've done and the stage they've set, I really can't sit back and say much. In fact, I essentially become Statler and Hilton from the Muppets, sitting up in the back row kibitzing down. We had what would appear to be two very different presentations, one on childhood vaccination, the other one on fracking. But I think there are some underlying trends or discussion that exist between the three of them that speak more broadly to how science is used in policy development, policy making, roles and responsibilities within that milieu, and how do we actually integrate the views of, for lack of a better term, the public into that black box of policy making that exists within government. So in listening to the three pieces, or the two pieces, there are really 3 points that struck me as being constant throughout all of our discussion. First one was around data. And data I use broadly to be information, as well as that hard numeric stuff all the science types know and love. A second one really speaks to institutions and governance, and who's responsible for doing this type of work, and how do we integrate it into the piece. And then the third part really picks up on the notion of people, and what do they have to say, and how does it influence decision making? How do you integrate it? And it looks at that question of how effective is this notion of integrating lay knowledge into a decision that's really got a very hard science base, and whether there is the trust that's in place to allow us to make those effective decisions that are respectful of all the communities out there. So let's quickly go through those three pieces. From a data perspective, the challenge I look at is what data is out there, what information, whether it's that good academic type of data that's available, gray literature, and how does it fit in, and that type of government developed surveillance information, and then that lay knowledge base, and how do the three pieces react, and do you integrate it? Very much questions about timeliness of the data, whether it's appropriate to the decision that has to be taken, whether it's been fully evolved so that it can be used effectively. Is there willingness of individuals to listen to the data and accept what's being made and decided? And is it comprehensive enough to permit that policy discussion and decision process going forward? Underlying that is, how do you tie it all together in a reasonable analysis so that you can tell a story that will resonate with the actual decision maker in 1 or 2 pages? The second piece really is about institutions and governance, and whose responsibility is it to reach out to the public, gain their insights, and help integrate it into that decision process. That's always a difficult question. And over the course of the last 50 years, we've had the opportunity to look at various topic matters, whether in Laura's case, it's fracking and its rolled out over the last 20 years or so, childhood, well, almost any number of public health issues, and how do you integrate those types of decisions into place? And even if we go back to a future presentation and start talking about genomics, and how do you manage the perceived risk of genomics coming into our general marketplace is always going to be a challenge. And that goes back to the question of risk management and its data and risk analysis. So, and even if you have done the best job you can do in pulling information together and making it tell an effective story, the underlying challenge is to see what individuals have to say, how they have to say it, and whether they're willing to listen to different viewpoints, or are they, in fact, basing their decisions on their own preconceptions and are unwilling to change. And I think if I can become political for a moment, what we're seeing now is this polarization of decision or of viewpoints between the conservative and liberals anywhere in the world. And how does that impact on decision making when you're looking at information that may lean one way or another to provide an effective decision? Perhaps one of those areas that provide an example of that challenge is around substance use and public health measures to reduce the likelihood of illness and injury from substance use versus the more conservative viewpoints about limiting access to drugs. So a challenge that raises the question of how well are people listening, whether they're willing to accept different viewpoints based on information or not, and how it all ties together. So, and I think I've heard those points throughout both of the presentations. With that, let me just shift gears a little bit. And as a practitioner or so-called practitioner, or I think, Monica, you referred to us as pracademics in one piece of information, piece of paper that floated past. I came in with a viewpoint based really on risk analysis, risk management, government systems, and integration. And how do you take good data and make it into good policy? We heard about some of those challenges from Laura on pieces on fracking, which left us saying, how do you actually do this? And I looked at, and actually was somewhat involved in Kieran's piece of work to get that sense of what is the understanding of the academic community and the lay public versus what I've come to know as the way government works. And it's been quite enlightening to sit from a practitioner's viewpoint and integrate hopefully some of the positive steps I've heard out of those various pieces into what was my own work at the time. So I think with that, we'll turn it over to you, Monica, and hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion.
That is terrific. Thank you so much, Frank. Lots to chew on there for sure. And I would encourage people who are in attendance to avail themselves of the Q&A and pose a question. If you have a question, looking down the list of names, we appear to have a really nice mix of practitioners and academics. But maybe while we're waiting for questions to start rolling in, I'll give Kieran and Laura an opportunity to respond to Frank's comments if it prompted something for you. Any thoughts from either of you? Kieran, maybe I'll go to you first. We'll go in reverse order this time.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. I'm not a policy person at all, really, and the funny thing though is that because I do policy adjacent work in psychology, often not many people, but some people view me as a policy person, which, as I said, is strange because I really am not, and it's still very opaque to me to how decisions get made. So when we do these deliberative processes, we we have the hope, and often often this is not just an abstract thing. I mean, we work very hard at kind of finding links with policymakers, and we try to also identify issues that are ready for policy uptake to work on. But of course, sometimes there are issues that I and my colleagues are convinced that really that need democratic input, and childhood vaccination is one of those things where there's no receptor uptake at all. Public health is quite resistant, and this was you mentioned that you had some involvement with our process, and I think this is something we really valued about your involvement, and Frank came to this deliberative process because there was just not a lot of interest, and I think there was also some fear when it comes to vaccination. There seems to be, I have the sense, some fear around public input because you don't want that crazy anti-vaxxer. Like, I think there's like a real attribution out there that is not actually borne out in practice. Like, I mean, you can have what we showed with the process, you can have very meaningful public discussions about these things that are highly sophisticated, and I would argue in many ways more sophisticated than expert discussions, because expert discussions are often very, very siloed and narrow and do not consider multiple perspectives. So just something like that.
I'm just going to, go ahead, Frank.
Just to respond very quickly, I think you're quite right about the question of the fear of expert groups to accept a more broader public discussion, and particularly in an area like childhood vaccination, which has a very long history, a very complex organizational structure, if I can use that terminology, in decision-making, and a true reliance on expert groups as opposed to the more formalized government, public health, regulatory, and governance structures. So.
Before going to Laura, Kieran, there's a question here that I think would be well positioned to be posed now. But the question is your thought that when it comes to implementing public health decisions, the public should be polled first? And I think I know what your answer will be, but I want to hear you on that.
My answer is absolutely no.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely no. And my reason for that is because that polls are top of the head responses, and that's not what you want. Like, so I don't want somebody who has not thought about collective interests, who hasn't even informed themselves on the issues. I don't want that person having any influence on decisions about that affect my children getting vaccinated. I don't want that. But what I do want is meaningful, informed public discussion that goes across different life experiences, across different values, across different vested interests, that these things should be brought into the open and deliberated, like explicitly talked about in the public sphere, and that should be a part of the policy decision-making process. So polling, no, absolutely no. Deliberation, yes.
Kieran, and again, just to encourage or invite you to expand a little bit more, because some folks listening might say, well, geez, how realistic is that? Are we going to have this informed public discussion among 37 million Canadians, or however many we are now? But maybe can you give sort of the 30 to 60 second version of the deliberative process that is discussed in the chapter?
Okay, so there's a lot of theory behind this. So I'm just going to very quickly take out the main point. So Mark Warren at UBC talks about limited democratic resources, right? We can't all be involved in all decisions that affect us. It's simply not feasible. But what we can do is we can host and arrange for deliberative forums that are designed to get as wide as possible a range of perspectives on an issue. We can bring these people together, we can inform them about different perspectives, and we can give them the freedom to talk, ideally over several days or more, talk through the issues, consider trade-offs that you have to make. So for example, in childhood vaccination, there is a very real trade-off between an increasing vaccination uptake and respecting autonomy. So you gotta find that balance. Who decides where to draw that line and make that balance? Well, the argument is that in part it should be a informed public process that helps inform that, not by itself. Experts have a very vital role in this, but informing that. And so you can run these kind of processes on any number of issues, and so yes, the argument would be that you could do this even in a country like Canada that is large and has a large population, with small groups that are strategically selected.
Yeah, and Kieran, you actually did that and talk about that process in your chapter. Right. So yeah. Well worth a look for folks who are interested. So Laura, you've been very patient. Responses to Frank's comments?
I mean, I really did set out when I was thinking through what I wanted to do on the research is think about, does this work? How does it work? And to your point, my case actually speaks to all the things that you shouldn't do. So it was sort of series of engagements that didn't speak to sort of the fundamental question of should we proceed with this. It very quickly became consultation about a narrow range of things, and it was very quickly a consultation about how do we make it safe to proceed. And this happened in the context where a lot of the academic literature, a lot of the expertise hadn't quite landed on sort of what the impacts of fracking truly, were. So there was still lots of controversy about how they impacted human health, lots of controversy about how poorly they could impact the environment or not. And so those things collided in my case. And it's sort of, listening to Kieran, obviously there are much better ways of having those public discussions. In the case of fracking, it's sort of one of those unfortunate things that they went ahead with a policy decision when they didn't even know in New Brunswick if the resource existed. It was still under exploration, but there was a policy decision that was in place to proceed. And so I do think that one of the most important parts about engagement is leaving that sort of discussion open to whether we should or can do this. And that speaks to the democratic piece that Kieran was saying. Where's the line of, is this something we want for our society? Do we want it in all of the areas that we're finding it, sort of the shale resource? Or should we localize production and use the resources, use that money to then power clean tech, for example, and get ourselves away from oil and gas? There are much broader policy discussions that could be had, but it very quickly narrowed in on a very risk management approach to one specific direction. So sort of maybe that's a little bit of what I would say in that context.
Yeah, and I think we're going to need to draw this to a close. We're starting to zero in on 1 p.m. and I think one of the things that just comes through so clearly in the book, not to be trite, but it's complex, right? These are really challenging decisions to take, really challenging processes to develop. Oh, we have a late arrival question here. So we have just maybe a little bit of time to respond to it. So the question is, can you say a bit about how we select or train the experts that are well suited to participate in public deliberation? We often focus on what kind of public to recruit, not the crazy anti-vaxxers in quotation marks, but those willing to listen to data, having thought about the issues, etc. But we also need experts who are willing to listen to the public and their values and concerns. So any final thoughts on that? Maybe I'll just go to you, Kieran, given that time is tight.
That's a really great question. Thank you. Yeah, so I think at least with the way I've done it with my colleagues, there are multiple models that you can use for public deliberation, and in each model, there's different places where experts play a role. So the process that we use, we hand over the deliberation to members of the public. Now, when I say members of the public, these are people with very diverse educational backgrounds. So there might well be a lawyer in there, a medical doctor, and so on. And then of course there'll also be construction workers, and like ideally you'll get the whole mix, right? But when we say public, that doesn't mean uneducated. It means just a wide selection of people, right? So, but what we do is we keep separate from that experts on the specific issue that we're discussing. So they are excluded from selection, but they get brought in as individuals, as experts or stakeholders who give short presentations at the beginning to frame the event. So and we do need to be very careful when we select those, because what we want to do is we want to select a diversity of perspectives. So we do a lot of background work to make sure we have key perspectives selected in that. So that's, I think, one role of experts. Then we usually in our processes have, at the end of the deliberative process, we have a decision maker or policy panel. And quite rightly, we want to select people who are willing to listen. And so there's usually a bit of self-selection that goes on, because people who are not open to kind of sort of public input usually don't agree to come to these processes anyway. And different kind of topics, we have had different levels of success in engaging at that level. But ideally, I think, yes, you want to have people who are open to listening and not just speaking.
And maybe just the one thing I would add, and then we are going to have to call it for time, is that there is a chapter in the book around science and technology education. So there's this whole issue of the training. Do we need to kind of rethink some of our training or expand some of our training in science, engineering, and technology programs to ensure that we are exposing people, sensitizing scientists to all of the issues that we've been talking about here today. So I want to just very quickly, and I'm going to have to pass it off to our communications and outreach specialists who will be closing things off for us here, but I want to just thank all of you today for taking the time to be with us, to the audience members, to our speakers. Big thank you to Genevieve Dunn for organizing this for us, and of course also to our funders, the partner organizations, all of the members of the research team, Palgrave Macmillan, everybody who made this possible. So Jen, over to you for final words.
Thank you so much, Monica. So yeah, I'd like to start closing remarks just by thanking our participants for joining us on their lunch hour today. And of course, thank you, our panel members, and Monica as our moderator, for the really interesting discussion today. And congratulations to the whole at-risk team for the excellent publication. As Monica mentioned, it is available on open access. So the link to that page was shared in the chat if you're interested in learning more. I've also shared a link to our link tree for ISSP if you'd like to access our website, learn more about our events or our blogs, as well as sign up to our newsletter, where you can get the latest news and activities about the ISSP, as well as our whole network in the science policy society field. So thank you all so much for your time today. Thank you to our panelists. And this concludes our last food for thought of the 22-23 academic year. So we wish you all a great summer, and we look forward to seeing you next fall. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.